Welcome to Grammar and Punctuation video number 5. In this video, we're moving on from punctuation to grammar, and we're going to talk about pronoun usage. To start off, we're going to look at some basics about pronouns. The one thing that we want to remember is that a pronoun replaces a noun, and the noun that the pronoun replaces is called the antecedent. So we must remember that the pronoun and antecedent must always agree in person, number, and gender. And generally speaking, I just want you to remember that the pronoun needs to make sense with regard to the antecedent. That's really what we're talking about. Another thing that we want to remember about pronouns is that they're not always related to person. They're not always personal pronouns like I, she, they, etc. Often they'll replace an object, like a car. A car can be replaced with it, usually later in a sentence. Which or that can also function as pronouns. These are called relative pronouns. They create relative clauses. Now, I don't care if you remember what a relative clause is, but we need to remember that which or that and a few other pronouns like which or that have special functions related to the grammar and punctuation that we've learned so far. So let's take a look at this example. How many pronouns can you spot in this sentence, and what are the antecedents that go along with the pronouns? So we have the car had a new paint job, which transformed it into a bright orange beauty. Well, if we look up here, we have it, and we have which. We have those words in this sentence too. So if we restate this sentence, we'll see that we have the car had a new paint job. The paint job transformed the car into a bright orange beauty. So you can see that which is functioning as a pronoun here, and so is it. We're not usually going to run into agreement errors with which and that. They just come into play with our double comma rule that we looked at earlier. So when we're talking about that and which, we're talking about a very specific type of pronoun. There are others in this group. We have whose, whoever, whomever, who, and whom. These all create what I like to call about clauses. When we want to say something about someone or about an object, we will use these pronouns to do so. There are three main types of about clauses. The first one we're going to look at involves the word that. One thing we want to remember is when we use the word that, we are denoting that the information in the sentence is extremely important. It can't be removed. Do you remember the double comma rule? When we use two commas to separate a fragment within an independent clause, we're stating that that information is less important. It can be removed and it won't change the meaning of the sentence. When we use the word that in a clause to describe something, we are actually stating that the information is important to the meaning of the sentence. Let's look at an example. We ate the pizza that was really fattening last night. Well, you'll notice that we don't have commas here, and that's because we started this clause with the word that. This actually means that there are more choices here. It could be confusing if we take that out. In this case, there's more than one pizza. Maybe there are several pizzas on a table, and we ate the one that was more fattening, or really fattening, last night. So you can see we're identifying a very specific pizza out of a bunch of choices. Let's look at another example. The bike that is painted blue is my favorite. Can you tell what that means? Well, we don't have commas, of course, because of the word that, and there are multiple bikes to choose from. So we might be in a bike store and say, the bike that is painted blue is my favorite. This follows the double comma rule that we've already learned. The fragment in red should not be removed. It is the same rule we've already went over. It's just that this is important, so we're not going to put those commas in. Let's look at another type of about clause. This one involves using the word which. We just reviewed that clauses, and we know the information in those clauses cannot be removed from the sentence. Well, which clauses are the opposite? The information is denoted as not integral to the understanding of the sentence. Let's look at some examples. We ate the pizza, which was really fattening last night. Hopefully you can feel that there's only one pizza in this case. We're just saying something about that pizza. There's only one. The bike, which is painted blue, is my favorite. Can you tell what this one means? In this case, there's only one bike, and we're just saying something about it. So there's only one. So unlike the bike store, we just have a single bike. Unlike the table full of pizzas, we just have one pizza on the table, and we're just saying something about it. That is the difference between that and which clauses. Which clauses can be removed, so they will have the commas, always, and that clauses can't be removed, and they will never have the commas. All right, the last about clause that we're going to look at is related to the word who. This clause begins with the word who, and it kind of sits in between the two rules we looked at. With that clauses, we know the information must remain in the sentence. And with which clauses, we know the information could be taken out, therefore we use two commas. With a who clause, we can choose which way it's going to go by what we intend the sentence to mean. So in this first example, we spoke to the kids who were standing around and learned from them. You'll notice that we don't have commas, so we're saying that this is integral to the meaning of the sentence. It can't be removed. This also means that there is one specific group of kids that we're talking about, but there are others around. There are some kids who are not standing around. So we need to make sure that we're identifying the specific group that we're talking about. When we look at the other way, we spoke to the kids who were standing around and learned from them. Well, hopefully you can see or even feel this when you read it. Once we see these commas, we can tell that this is just a descriptor of these kids. There are no other kids around. We're not going to make a mistake in identity here, so this can be removed from the sentence. We were just looking at an example using the word who, but sometimes in sentences we need to use the word whom instead. So let's take a look at this rule to try and differentiate between the uses. Who is used as a pronoun when it represents the subject of the clause or simple sentence. So when we have a sentence and we're going to restate the subject of that sentence, which would be a person, we use the word who. Here's an example. Ruprecht is the one who is good at baseball. Well, we need to determine the subject of the sentence to be sure that this who is being used correctly. Well, who is doing the major action, or who is the sentence about? Those are the questions we need to ask, and of course in this case it's Ruprecht. That's our noun. Now all we need to do is try and replace that pronoun with that noun. Ruprecht is good at baseball. It works perfectly fine, therefore who is being used correctly. We can also replace it with he or she to check. So we can say he is good at baseball, or if it was a female at the front here, we could say she is good at baseball. Another example. It was the woman in the front, I would guess, who knew the answer. Okay, well, we're talking about someone knowing, and we're talking about somebody in the front. We know it's the woman. That is the subject of our sentence here. So once again, we'll go over to the word who and replace it. The woman knew the answer. Or in this case, if we want to use this rule up here, replacing he or she knew the answer. Whom functions quite a bit differently than who. We know that who represents the subject of the clause, but whom represents what is known as the object of the clause. An object is a noun that is directly related to the action of the verb. Okay, it's a different noun than the subject. Let's take a look at this first clause. I learned from an instructor. Well, our subject is I. Our verb is learned. Is there another noun related to this learning? Yes, it's from an instructor. I learned from the instructor. So here is our object. If we take a look at whom over here in this second clause, what does whom represent? Whom I found to be quite knowledgeable. Well, the instructor is the person I found to be quite knowledgeable. So I found the instructor to be quite knowledgeable. Therefore, we use whom. We can also check this by replacing him or her. I learned from him. I found him to be quite knowledgeable. It doesn't matter if whom comes first, it's still what's going on in the sentence if we can identify the subject and the verb. Here's another example. The surgeon is whom you should call. This one could be tricky because we have a noun at the beginning that is not the subject. We need to think about the primary action. Who is doing the calling? You are. You should call the surgeon. Subject, verb, object. Once again, that's why we're using whom. Now I'd like you to take a couple minutes and go through this text and try and correct any errors that you can find in punctuation and grammar. So pause the video and come back when you're done. Let's take a look at the answers. Last week, we found several items at the flea market. Okay, we can put a period there, so we're assuming that that semicolon is correct, but let's go back to this first comma. Last week is a fragment before our independent clause. We found several items at the flea market. So remember, when you have a fragment and you're introducing your independent clause, make sure you use a comma here. This is a common area where students leave out the comma, so make sure that you study this if you didn't get that one. Moving on to the semicolon, we'll read onward. For example, well, we know that that's a conjunctive adverb. We have a comma after the conjunctive adverb, so this would be correct, and we're hoping for an independent clause afterward. We purchased a toaster oven. Well, we know that is one, so we know everything before this is correct. We have a comma here, which had some free food inside. Well, we have a which clause, and we know which clauses always take commas because they can be removed. Okay? We purchased the toaster oven. This is just something about it. If we used that here, we know it would have to be in there, and there would be more than one toaster oven. But in this case, there's just one, so this comma is perfectly fine. I placed a period here because we're moving on with somewhat of a different thought here, and we need a break in our punctuation. If you put a semicolon here, stylistically you'd be incorrect. This isn't technically a conjunctive adverb, it's just an adverb modifying what we're talking about next. Remember that conjunctive adverbs, like this one up here, for example, give us direction in thought, where we are going with our thoughts. So, for example, therefore, moreover, these tell us where we're going with our thoughts. Luckily is just telling us this just happened luckily, okay? So, luckily is an introductory fragment just like last week, so we have a comma afterward. So again, if you missed this one, you'll want to review that concept. Luckily, it was my brother who ate the chunk of cheese, comma, which was moldy, comma, and he became ill. Okay, a lot going on here. It was my brother who. Okay, we used who here. That means we're saying that this is the subject. Well, what is the subject of this clause? Well, it's the brother doing the eating. Okay, the brother ate the chunk of cheese, so who is correct? And which was moldy, we're saying that there's only one chunk of cheese here, so we can take this out. Okay, and then, and he became ill, we have a coordinating conjunction, so you'll see that this comma is actually functioning in two ways at once. What a wonderful comma. And he became ill. So that is the answer for this question. And I have down here, how would the meaning change if the final which was that? Okay, so let's go over that. It was my brother who ate the chunk of cheese that was moldy and he became ill. Hopefully you can tell there would be more than one chunk of cheese to choose from, and he ate the one that was moldy. The way that it's written here, there's only one chunk of cheese possible. He ate that chunk, which was moldy, and he became ill. That wraps up Grammar and Punctuation video number 5. Make sure that you revisit this video if any of the concepts gave you any trouble.